When you hear the term gestation, people are just talking about that period of prenatal development. And so typically we divide gestation into 3 trimesters, right? First 3 months, second 3 months, final 3 months of gestation. Now this table gives you lots of different things that are taking place during these trimesters. What I want you to realize is kind of the big overall trend. So in the first trimester, really what we're thinking about is the beginnings of all the major organ systems. This is typically considered the most fragile period of prenatal development, and the difficulty is that first 3 months, the woman might not even realize that she's pregnant, right? So a woman of childbearing age who has the potential of becoming pregnant should be using alcohol in moderation, taking prenatal vitamins to make sure there's enough folate to support this early development, particularly of things like the nervous system, because really this first trimester is laying the groundwork. Any problems that develop in the first trimester are then just going to be compounded as development continues. In the second trimester, we actually start to see those organs developing. So they'll go through here and tell you about actually being able to see, hear a heartbeat, the eyes have developed, those sorts of things. And then really in the third trimester, a lot of this is really about growing and putting on weight. And when when I'm saying putting on weight, that could be obviously from the fetus growing, but also adipose deposition. So not putting all the energy that they're stealing from mom into actual growth, but now actually storing up some reserves for when they make it to the outside world. So we'll focus in here primarily on the first trimester as we start to lay down the basics of this process. So really, in this first trimester, there is so much going on here, right? So for example, we'll talk about a few things here. Really early on in development, this cleavage process, right, cellular division without growth, is going to be very dominant. We'll also talk about implantation. So at about the end of the first week or so of development, we're going to need to implant into the uterus to support further growth. We'll also see during this first trimester, of course, we're not going to stay a zygote, right? We want to get to the point where we actually have a functional embryo, something that we think can go on. And so there's a lot of changes that need to take place here as far as differentiation of cells. And then also in the first trimester, we need to start to develop the placenta, this organ that's partially produced by the fetus and partially produced by mom that's going to support that growth and development. So let's take a look at kind of these 4 important things that are going on in the first trimester. So this image, 29-2, is showing us really early parts of development, right? So here we see that first division taking place post-fertilization, right? So somewhere in that first day even, cellular division begins. And this is a really nice look at cleavage. So they purposefully made these circles the exact same size, right? But each time that division takes place, you just end up with tons of tiny cells. And this eventually is going to become what's called the blastocyst. Blastocyst. And this is a hollow ball of cells. Hollow ball of cells. Okay? One of the things that I find really fascinating in this is notice what happens here. Hatching. Hatching? So notice up until this point that zona pellucida, that glycoprotein-rich kind of shell that was protecting the oocyte has been there, and then somewhere around day 4 or 5, the blastocyst actually comes out of that. So that's called hatching. Now, with the blastocyst, a couple things to notice, right? These are all cells that came from the division of that initial zygote. But we're really going to break this into two very different regions. So we have what's called the inner cell mass, and we also have the trophoblast. Okay, so within the blastocyst, some of the cells are making up the inner cell mass. This is destined to become the embryo. The other portion, the trophoblast, anybody taken ecology? Do you remember trophic levels, different feeding levels? The trophoblast is going to support the nutrition. It's going to grab the nutrients and give them to the inner cell mass. And so this is always so fascinating to me. That zygote, that fertilized egg, some of the cells are going to go on to become the embryo and therefore the fetus and then the baby and then, right? But some of those cells kind of take one for the team and do a bunch of work to support the developing embryo. It's kind of interesting. Okay, so inner cell mass, trophoblast. Okay. So that's really when they're talking about cleavage taking place. That's what we're looking at. The next step then is going to be implantation. Cleavage and then implantation. And implantation is just going to be when the blastocyst actually attaches itself to that endometrial lining. So here we see the blastocyst. It's in the uterine cavity, right? So they're showing it being down here in the uterus. Typically, implantation is going to occur either in the body or the fundus of the uterus. As the blastocyst is traveling in the uterus, it's actually being nourished, right? Remember these uterine glands, they're producing a ton of glycogen-rich substance, and that's actually feeding the blastocyst. Now, the blastocyst is eventually going to make contact with that endometrial lining. Right? And that is implantation. Now, what happens is the part of the trophoblast, remember they're showing the trophoblast here in purple, the part of the trophoblast that makes contact with the endometrium, those cells start dividing rapidly. They divide really rapidly and they never actually even bother building more cell membranes. And so you end up with this area called the syncytial trophoblast that's growing rapidly into the endometrium and trying to steal nutrients from those uterine glands, right? So this, once we have implantation, the portion of the trophoblast that's in contact with the endometrium becomes the syncytial trophoblast. Syncytial trophoblast. There's a mouthful. Okay, now you're looking at that going, this is crazy, but check it out. Do you remember other times when we've talked about something being maybe a functional syncytium, right? This is the same root here. We talked about cardiac muscle. All the cells contracting as one, right? Because they had gap junctions and ions could flow through. They could act as one. They were acting as a syncytium. So all they're referring to here is the fact that when this cell division took place, those cells essentially all just fuse into one and act as one. Okay? This syncytiotrophoblasts then, right, here we actually see it putting out little villi, little arms to increase the surface area. It's using hyaluronidase. Same enzyme that we saw sperm using. The syncytiotrophoblasts uses hyaluronidase to essentially erode the endometrium and reach further inside, kind of erode those uterine glands and steal the nutrients for the inner cell mass. Here we actually see the inner cell mass has developed to the point, we're on day 9, the inner cell mass has 2 cell layers, and it's actually now separating itself from that trophoblast. We see the very beginning of what we call the amniotic cavity. Here, this is so remarkable to me, right? Notice what's happening here. We're digging into the endometrium to get the nutrients from those glands, and the endometrium is essentially just going to heal itself over, right? And at this point, that, again, developing embryo has no contact even with the uterine cavity, which is kind of fascinating to me. So that is how implantation occurs. Now, something I did want to point out, right, is as this is going along, even those little changes like the 2 cell layers, the amniotic cavity, all along here we are doing this embryogenesis, right? We're trying to get to the point where we have this viable layer. One of the really important things that happens here is we develop the 3 germ layers. So think about, this is all part of embryogenesis. And here they're showing you, right, day 15, so this is still really early on. We end up with these 3 germ layers. I usually emphasize this way back in, what was that, chapter 4 was about tissues, right? The origins of all these different tissues are from each of these 3 developmental layers. So there is ectoderm layer, mesoderm, and endoderm, right? Outside, middle, inside. Now, the ectoderm becomes some very obvious things like the integument. But in a little twist of weirdness, and we can talk about this more, part of the ectoderm kind of folds in on itself and actually makes the nervous system, right? Which in the adult is about as inside and protected as you can get. But it does come from this ectoderm. The mesoderm, this is going to be things like the skeleton and skeletal muscle. Skeleton and muscle. And the endoderm, maybe thinking about some really deep things like accessory organs on the digestive tract, right? Liver and pancreas, the respiratory system, things like that. So even at day 15, we're starting to set up the future differentiation of those cells and at least the roots of organ systems. Figure 29.5 continues to show embryogenesis, right? How that embryo is changing. This is week 10. Right? So the first trimester ends at week 12, and so you can see that a lot of development takes place. Now, 29.5, you might want to look at this one. It's going to be a little hard to see. What I wanted to point out here is also this formation of what are called the extra-embryonic membranes. They're also showing the formation of the placenta. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I wanted to point out these 4 membranes. So the first one is called the yolk sac. Right? They're showing that in this bright yellow, right? Just like a yolk in a chicken egg. And this yolk is going to be an important part of the nutrition as we're starting development here. And then it's sort of, so nutrition. Once we really get the placenta developed and we can take a lot of nutrients from mom, then the yolk sac kind of transfers over to being an important part of fetal blood production. So if you recall from the blood chapter, we did mention that before the bone marrow is ready to produce blood, that actually starts in the yolk sac and then moves to the liver for a little bit and then finally moves into that medullary cavity. Our second membrane here is called the amnion. And the amnion is going to be this large sac that's holding the developing embryo and then eventually the developing fetus. Here you see the amniotic sac taking up a huge portion of the uterus. And this really is meant to cushion that developing embryo and fetus, right, kind of floating it in there. You may be familiar with that word from hearing about amniocentesis. So in amniocentesis, a needle can be inserted and cells can be drawn out, right? Even during development, those epithelial cells, skin cells, are being shed from the fetus, and by sucking out a little bit of that amniotic fluid, you can do DNA analysis on those cells and look for potential problems. The allantois, I think it's French, the allantois and I don't speak French, so forgive me if I'm butchering that, right? So the allantois is going to be for collecting waste. In fact, this extra embryonic membrane eventually moves inside of the pelvic cavity, and this is going to become the bladder. Okay. And finally, we have the chorion. And the chorion, let's see if we can see kind of what color they're doing here in this pink, right? This is going to be the part that's actually, again, helping get the nutrients. So it's going to be very important in the formation of the placenta as it's trying to get the nutrients to that developing embryo. So let's put placenta there. So let's look at this in a little more close up here. Okay. So we can zoom in, right? Here's where we're able to start seeing the amnion and the yolk sac, right? Sorry, this picture is way too small, right? But you know what those are now. Again, notice that this is all still inside. That endometrium has kind of closed over on our embryo here. Okay. And so we start to see that developing, right? The embryo is continuing to change along with these membranes, right? It gets larger. Yolk sac, again, the amnion is getting a lot bigger. Okay. Here in week 5, we actually start to see this kind of bulging out into the body of the uterus, right? And here's where the placenta starts to become much more obvious. Notice it's those chorionic villi, right, still reaching out to the endometrium, to those maternal tissues to try to get the nutrients from them. As the embryo develops and kind of pulls further away there, that's when we get what we would call the umbilical cord, right? So we'll have blood vessels connecting the developing embryo to the placenta. It also, that umbilical cord also includes the yolk sac, the allantois, those sorts of things, right? And here we are in week 10 with a very obvious umbilical cord, very obvious now placenta. So the formation of this placenta, this is such a fascinating organ, right? It is part made by cells, right, that were in that trophoblast, the result of fertilization, and then also part maternal structures. So here we see the umbilical cord, right, umbilical arteries and vein taking care of the baby, right? And here's our chorionic villi. So notice what happens here is we're developing this capillary system where we can use diffusion to get nutrients from mom. There is not just a straight exchange, right? So notice this is the maternal structures, right, in the endometrium, and it's not like a blood vessel goes directly from mom into the baby. Instead, these blood vessels have been broken open and eroded, and essentially blood just fills this whole area, right? They talk about these little pits, lacuna, and this actually develops into quite a large area that these chorionic villi then can reach into, and with those capillary loops, allow diffusion. If you recall from the blood chapter, fetal hemoglobin actually has a stronger affinity for oxygen, and so as that blood passes through here, it can take oxygen from the maternal blood. We'll also see the diffusion of water, nutrients, wastes are leaving the baby, dumping into this space to get cleaned up by mom's liver, mom's kidney, those sorts of things. So the placenta is actually a pretty fascinating organ. Okay, so then they have just some really nice images, right? So this is the end of our first trimester. Again, the rudiments of all of the organ systems have formed at this point in time. Week 8, there's week 12. Okay, so the end of the first trimester. From there, right, we're going to enter the second and third trimester. Again, not as much to say there. Just remember that second trimester, really, we're developing those organs. In the third trimester, it's really about growth and putting on some adipose, putting on some fat. I just threw this in here because I think this is hilarious, right? When people are pregnant and they start talking about the baby growth chart according like what size fruit the baby would be at certain weeks. So here we go. At the end of the first trimester, you have a plum. I don't know how they picked pumpkins and things like that, but